KOWS 107.3 FM, Occidental, California. On the telephone from Boulder, Colorado, I believe we have Professor Stephen Vanderheiden. Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Our time has come. Thank you, sir, for coming on to talk to us today. Dr. Stephen Vanderheiden is a Ph.D., University of Wisconsin at Madison, Associate Professor of Political Sciences and Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the Professorial Fellow at the Center for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics in Australia. So far accurate?
That is right. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Vanderheiden specializes in normative political theory and environmental politics. More about that in a few minutes. Published on topics ranging from Rousseau to democratic theory. And the book that is quite significant recently and these days is called Atmospheric Justice, a Political Theory of Climate Change. It won the ISA's 2009 Harold and Margaret Sprout Award, given annually to the best book in international environmental politics. He's also the editor of Political Theory and Global Climate Change, published by MIT Press. Numerous articles and book chapters, Political Theory and Environmental Politics, and more. Graduate seminars, politics and literature, etc., etc. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
We're starting up again in Durban, South Africa today, correct?
It's starting. I should know this. It's starting sometime in early December, I thought. But yes, we're starting up very soon with the 17th Conference of the Parties.
Yeah, I think today's newspaper, it says today's the day.
Okay.
So I'll fill you in.
Okay.
And the headline, of course, not of course, but the headline is very, very telling and really kind of heartbreaking as well. The headline is, "At Meeting on Climate Change, Urgent Issues but Low Expectations." So, this is, by now, most of us, at least most of our listeners, are very well aware of the our flirtation with catastrophe and how it's greatly past time that we take fundamental and dramatic positive action toward this very real situation that is poised to affect us in ways that I don't think we fully yet appreciate.
Right.
So I'm talking too much already. Why don't you say hello to our listeners and
Right. Yeah. Well, no, you're right. And in fact, I just called it up, and 28 November through December 9th is the scheduled meeting period for Durban. Low expectations are not a huge surprise, given the last two conferences of the parties, where in anticipation of the expiration of the Kyoto Protocol's compliance period in 2012, there was no progress at all made toward a Kyoto successor. And the expectations were set quite a while ago when a number of important players in advancing the Kyoto Treaty announced that they wouldn't sign on into any kind of successor, including Japan, of course, which hosted that 1997 conference that produced the Kyoto Protocol, but also Canada and some others. Low expectations can be good, though, in some ways. I mean, to put a perhaps somewhat optimistic spin on it, high expectations can increase a lot of pressure on negotiators to reach a deal, and this can sometimes be what stands in the way of a deal. Low expectations can allow negotiators to go under less pressure and sometimes negotiate some crucial smaller elements of an ongoing treaty process in a way that just is not possible when the spotlight is on to come up with a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. So you're right. It's disappointing that we're facing yet another one of these meetings where there's really little prospect of a full agreement being reached. But in the absence of that, there's still some fairly significant policy items that might well come away from Durban as successes, contributing to a Green Climate Fund to assist developing countries in reducing their carbon emissions and to adapting to climate change will be on the agenda. I think there's greater expectations for climate finance. Some technical aspects of the way that we measure compliance with treaties having to do with deforestation and reforestation projects. It's not a sexy output if we get some better agreement and some more details on that, but it's a fairly important advance nonetheless. So even though there are low expectations and we won't get anything like a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, let alone an improvement on it, there are things that might well happen in Durban by the time it finishes up in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. I think most of us understand that this is an urgent issue. And you're in a position to probably see this more clearly than most of us. So I guess I want to ask you, how urgent is our urgency?
Well, it's pretty urgent. A lot of observers, political observers, scientific observers of the process have been making this point, and your listeners, I assume, have already heard a lot of this before. But we're reaching tipping points on a lot of climate impacts, after which it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to restore previous environmental conditions. If we don't get some kind of international process in place soon is perhaps over the next 3 or 4 years, certainly by 2020, the chances of stabilizing the climate at a level that avoids catastrophic damage look pretty dim. So yeah, this is certainly urgent. We need to get something done internationally. Things have to be done on different levels as well, nationally, subnationally, cities, regions, even households need to start to change the way that we live and the way that we produce and consume energy if we're to avoid the predicted consequences of climate change. So yeah, it's very urgent.
Yeah. Are we still looking at 2 degrees centigrade?
Well, that was affirmed last year in Cancun as the target. And of course, at Cancun, at the last conference of the parties, there was a resolution to look into whether a more aggressive temperature target might be called for. 2 degrees would, of course, allow enough warming to inundate some low-lying coastal cities and small island states. And so they especially were pressing for more aggressive targets, perhaps 1.5 degrees. Some were pushing for 1. It'll probably be on the agenda whether to revisit the 2-degree target. Whether that makes a great deal of difference at this point, since what's really needed at this point are agreements on the steps necessary in order to reach that 2-degree goal, is another question. I think it'll be worth revisiting, but I'm not sure that it's a constructive area of debate at this point, when 2 degrees at this point seems like it might be optimistic.
Yeah.
But yeah, that'll come up. We have to at least start with some kind of a goal and then work backwards from there to see what it would take to reach a target like 2 degrees. And 2 degrees as a temperature stabilization goal for the 20th century, and that's degrees centigrade, would require emissions reductions on the order of 75% from those 1990 levels by the middle part of the century. So even at 2 degrees, we have a lot of work to do to try and meet those ambitions.
Yeah, and it's good work.
Oh, yeah, it's good work. It's work that has to be done. It's work that is much less painful if we do it sooner, and which can bring all kinds of benefits aside from those related to climate change. Yeah. Less local air pollution, less dependence on international trade in fossil fuels. There are all kinds of other reasons besides climate change why we might want to start down the path of cleaner energy system.
Yeah, there's this kind of overall sense that the changes that we need to make are they're terribly unhappy, or they're going to make us miserable. And I think the absolute opposite is true.
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to, but of course those who don't want to see changes at all portray the transition to a low-carbon energy economy to be one that's incredibly painful, incredibly costly. But you're right, it doesn't need to be that. It's like a very large ship turning, so it takes a while to transition away from getting energy from fossil fuels to deriving it from other sources. But there's no reason why it has to be that costly. Certainly there are costs, but what's typically not mentioned by those who paint a very dire picture of the costs is the set of benefits that come along with it. And when you compare the costs and the benefits, it looks much more modest, much more reasonable, and in some cases looks as though the benefits of decarbonizing can overwhelm the costs.
Well, I think if we had any sense that we were actually genuinely heading in the right direction, I think we'd all feel a lot better.
We would indeed.
Yeah.
We would indeed.
Professor Vanderheiden, at first engaging your work, especially an essay called "Globalizing Responsibility for Climate Change," and the book "Atmospheric Justice." My first impression was that this is pretty technical. This is pretty dry. This is this is pretty this is high policy. But when I relaxed into the work, I saw that this is very much the nuts and bolts of coming to understand what we're dealing with in different ways, all of which are important. So when you lay out concepts for us like mitigation, adaptation, compensation, these are practical ways of addressing this singular problem from different angles, some of which are complementary and some of which rub up against each other, but all of which have to be slowly understood for what they are. So I think it would be a great benefit to our listeners if we walked through some of these ideas.
Sure.
Okay?
Sure. It's certainly difficult to write a book or write essays that try and speak to my fellow academics, political theorists, political philosophers, as well as to the policy community and the activist community around international climate policy. You do have to use some kind of dry analytical tools, but behind that really is a pretty exciting, I think, and a pretty obviously controversial set of conflicts that I think those academic tools can illuminate. And I'll try and say a little bit more during our time today about how I think that might be the case.
Good. Well, let's start with mitigation. What does that mean?
Okay. Well, when people talk about climate change, they typically use mitigation as a category that describes all the different ways that we might reduce the net human contribution of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So this would include just reducing the release of carbon, say, the leading greenhouse gas into the atmosphere in the first place when we burn oil or burn coal. But it could also include activities that increase our capacity to sequester or store carbon. So we reforest an area that had been deforested in the past. Those trees serve as storehouses for carbon, and so they reduce the net release of a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So that's what mitigation refers to, and it really refers to all those things that we do to try and reduce the causes of climate change. And it serves as a nice category because, of course, within the development of climate policy, it's often thought that since the two do the same thing, it's just as good to reduce your combustion of fossil fuels and your release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that way as to increase our capacity to sequester those. And so we should treat them the same and see them as being the same general kind of activity. And of course we can do that by technological means. We could develop low carbon forms of energy or better ways of technologically capturing carbon when we produce energy, or we can do it through lifestyle or behavioral or policy changes that just require us to do less. And again, since the effect on climate is the same in all cases, it's useful to think of mitigation as just this one category. This is one of the things that we have to do over the course of the 21st century if we're to avoid the dangerous impacts on different kinds of systems of climate change.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have to do all these things.
We're going to have to do all those things. We're going to have to do some kind of a package. When we, at international meetings, design some kind of international policy where we say how much mitigation the United States or China or Brazil or the EU has to do by some date, 2020, 2040, 2060. We want to allow some flexibility in how those countries might meet those targets. And so we call it mitigation, where we could say that the United States plans to do it entirely through the development and implementation of some new technology, where people don't have to change their lifestyles at all. Perhaps we can go on using the same amount of energy as in the past and using the same kinds of devices, including cars, but do that in a way that reduces our carbon footprint, or perhaps we'll do it through some kind of change in expectations, change in lifestyles. Maybe we'll do it through some kind of sequestration activity. But it's up to us. We decide as a people together how we'll go about meeting those mitigation targets, and we want to leave that up to other countries as well. If China has some target, we don't want to dictate to them that they have to do it through technology or they have to do it by reducing their energy use individually or adjusting their expectations for what kind of lives they might lead, that they have to do it through sequestration or any other sort of mitigation activity. So talking about it as a category gives us the benefit of comparing things that really have the same effect, but also allowing then a broad range of options for the ways that communities or entire countries can go about meeting some kind of target.
Mm-hmm. Why has the United States dragged its feet so egregiously?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question, and I've tried to offer some kind of answer to it, and of course we can only guess whether it's primarily a set of economic interests that's too powerful that has prevented the political system from being able to adopt appropriate regulatory measures for carbon, or whether it's primarily an ideological resistance to any kind of international action at all. My hunch is that it's a primarily economic effect, that industries with a stake in unlimited carbon emissions especially don't want to see the United States sign on to any kind of carbon regulatory system, such as was the case under the Kyoto Protocol that would be binding, and very effectively worked to defeat ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, and have been working ever since, preventing serious carbon regulation or carbon pricing from gaining any kind of foothold on the policy agenda. Of course, there's an ideological story to be told as well. We don't like to engage in international agreements. There's some fear of the UN as an institution in certain ideological corners. So it's probably a mixed story, but I would say the economic one is probably the most compelling, plausible.
Yeah, and those of us who are laymen, who are laypersons,
right?
We know damn well it is.
Yeah, well, of course. And, it's not we, the laypersons in the U.S. that are the source of resistance. We're the sort of intermediaries. We get the message that's disseminated from the actors that really don't want to see carbon regulation. We get it in the form of political advertisements. We get it in the form of other sorts of messaging that tries to convince us of the skeptical case regarding climate science, or tries to exaggerate the costs of complying with some kind of international agreement. I guess somewhere there's a sense on the part of those who are resistant to regulating carbon that they have to convince the public to at least be skeptical about it as well. I'm not sure whether this is good news or not, that somehow the people have to at least cooperate in our refusal to act internationally on climate change. But we're not, you and I, the average member of the public, is not the decision maker in this case. There haven't been chances to vote in any kind of meaningful way, to express preferences on climate change and the political process and action on climate change. And when we take public opinion polls to ask people whether they support action on climate change, consistently we get majorities in the United States, declining majorities, but still majorities that show support for that kind of action. So to the extent that we haven't done anything, it's not a popular resistance primarily. It seems to be an elite resistance. Although one that still, for whatever reason, wants to cultivate a popular resistance as well, or at least to disseminate skepticism about the problem and the different kinds of solutions.
Yeah, well, my sense is we need to be a little less polite about all of this because we know that so much is at stake here.
Right.
And it all comes back to us. It's our responsibility.
Right. I certainly didn't mean to imply that the public should be polite in this regard. Going along is oftentimes the worst thing that we can do.
That's right.
And that's what really the carbon industry wants us to do, is to go along with the U.S.'s, at this point, traditional hostility to international climate regulation. And not going along can take more and less constructive variations, but politeness is, I don't think, any kind of advantage in trying to push the United States toward doing its share.
Citizenship is much more than consuming and voting.
Right. Ideally, anyway, yes. Yeah. Citizens, we should be challenging our policymakers where they don't respond to what their responsibilities are and what the public says that it wants.
Right, and we need to educate ourselves.
Indeed.
So adaptation, now this is quite a different animal than mitigation.
Right. So at this point, 2011, almost 2012, we're certain to see a fair amount of climate change. We've already seen some temperature rises and effects on weather patterns and so on. And so adaptation refers to that category of activities that we engage in deliberately to try and blunt the effect of climate changes on human welfare. So we build higher seawalls where we expect there to be more coastal flooding. We introduce drought-resistant crops where we can, where we have climate-related drought. So it refers to all those activities that might, while climate change happens, prevent that from harming people. So as opposed to preventing the causes of climate change, this is a way to try and control their effects. Of course, this is something that we have to do as well, and it's a different kind of responsibility than our responsibilities to mitigate climate change. And I've tried to argue in some of my more recent work, we have to think of these as being dual responsibilities, and ones that really require thinking about them in different terms. The reason we have to engage in adaptation activities now the reasons are different than the reasons why we now have mitigation obligations to face up to, and the way that we should decide how much different countries ought to pay or how much they ought to do for adaptation should be a different kind of formula. We should think about it in terms of different kinds of principles than the ones that we use to determine mitigation, or at least that's what I've been pressing.
Have you come across the oil depletion protocol, Richard Heinberg's work?
No. Tell me about that.
Well, there's not much that I can really say about it intelligently. It's been a while since I went through the material, but I am familiar with Richard Heinberg's work. He's a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and a fairly persuasive author about peak oil and related matters, resource depletion, etc. I just wondered if you had encountered his work at all.
No, I haven't. I made a note, and I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, he published something called the Oil Depletion Protocol, which to my naive eyes looks like, hey, this looks like a good idea.
Okay. Oftentimes, people from different kinds of backgrounds and from different fields stumble across a similar kind of problem and even invoke similar sorts of principles as a way to address the problem or to design a kind of fair response to the problem. And I have a hunch that he's probably invoked some of the same principles that I have when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. But I'll have to check it out.
I'm guessing that's the case. What's the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change?
Okay. Well, the Framework Convention itself, we can think of as being the document that was agreed to back in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, that set up the process that this Conference of the Parties that starts today in Durban is a part of. All the previous conferences of the parties, including the 97 one in Kyoto, Japan, that gave us the Kyoto Protocol, are sets of these annual meetings where the different parties come together to try and work up some kind of climate policy. These were all initiated by the process of the Framework Convention. The Framework Convention also set out some goals and some kind of framework principles for the ways that different groups of nations might commit to acting to advance those goals. So it identified climate change as being a common concern of mankind. All the delegates from all the countries at the Rio Convention or the Earth Summit agreed to that. It agreed that all the world needed to come together to address climate change and to avoid something that was identified as dangerous anthropogenic interference, and this gets at the temperature targets. But then it agreed to a fairly remarkable set of principles for the way that this would be done. It divided the world up into developed countries, and known as Annex I countries under the Framework Convention, and developing countries known as non-Annex I countries. And it said that since climate change was primarily a problem caused by the developed countries, that they'd be the ones that should take primary responsibility for addressing climate change, for reducing greenhouse emissions. What it said precisely was that all the world should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind. But then it went on with an evocative phrase that I spent a lot of time trying to unpack in my work. So to continue the quote, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So this suggests we're not all responsible, although we face a common problem, we're not all equally responsible for having caused the problem. This is that common but differentiated responsibilities language. And because of this significant disparity in responsibility for the problem, we should have different burdens. The very next sentence said that it was the developed countries that should take the lead in addressing climate change. And this Framework Convention then gave us a process. It gave us some goals. It didn't give us any policy framework at the time, but it set out as an urgent agenda item for the international community the creation of something like an international regime to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and then later, as it became more apparent that adaptation would be a necessary part of this regime as well, to finance and to undertake adaptation projects. So it's a document, it's a process, it's a set of goals, it's an identified set of principles. It's a lot of stuff all bundled together. And so when people talk about the Framework Convention, sometimes they mean that original document, sometimes they mean the process, sometimes they mean the goals, but it's all of those things.
And did I see that it was also described as a fundamentally ethical mission?
It is indeed. A major task, I would say the major task, is to determine some kind of fair assignment of burdens or assignment of responsibilities or assignment of targets, however you want to look at it, for the international response to climate change. And that's fundamentally an ethical, or I would say a problem of justice challenge. Even by 1992, climate change was not regarded as primarily a scientific problem, although we, of course, continue to study it and need to. The difficulties in addressing it internationally are primarily those. How do we decide who should do what? How much should we all do overall? But once we've decided that, how much should each of us do? How much should the United States do? How much should the EU do? How much and when should China, India, Brazil, developing countries exempted from binding targets under the Kyoto Protocol, how much should they do, and when should they have to start complying with binding targets? Those are ethical challenges, and they're hard ones. I mean, they're harder to solve than scientific problems in many ways, because we rely on frameworks of theories about ethics or theories about justice that don't give us the same kind of concrete, fact-based answers as the science questions do.
You published a short essay in Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, and you write, let's see, further greenhouse emissions caused foreseeable and therefore culpable rather than accidental harm. And no longer could parties plead ignorance concerning the causes and effects of climate change as a tenable strategy for deflecting responsibility for climate-related harm they continued to cause.
Right. Yeah, one question that comes up, and it comes up partly as a matter of scholarly interest, but I think it comes up on a much more important popular sense, is the question about culpability for climate change. Because, of course, if you even mention the term culpable at Durban or any one of these other conferences of the parties, immediately representatives from all of the industrialized countries would shout you down. They don't want to talk about culpability. Culpability implies a kind of moral responsibility, not only for having caused harm, but also then a moral responsibility or a legal responsibility to redress the harm. It requires compensation. But culpability is really a fairly important question in thinking about the ways that we might assign responsibilities or burdens for the way that we address climate change. And I write about some of the issues behind culpability in atmospheric justice to some length, because they've been a big part of the public debate about what we should do about climate change. If we don't know, this is the sort of layman's version of the culpability problem. If we don't know that the activities that we're engaging in are causing some kind of harm, we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because we're burning more oil than we need to, or we're wasting electricity that comes from coal. If we don't know that we're causing harm, you might wonder whether we're doing anything wrong. And if you're talking about having to pay for wrong that's been done, oftentimes the excuse, well, I didn't know that I was doing wrong, seems like an intuitively attractive one. And while I don't want to reject that intuition altogether, I think there are some problems with it, and I wanted to spend some time in my book trying to iron out some of the contours of reasonable ignorance about our effects on global climate of many of the acts that we engage in every day, and unreasonable ignorance. But I find it to be a moderately persuasive appeal to say, well, look, I didn't know that I was contributing to climate change. Don't tell me now that I'm responsible for having caused it. And don't tell me now that I owe someone something for having contributed in the past to climate change. I think it's a moderately persuasive excuse, but not a fully persuasive excuse, because anyone making that excuse now in 2011, and in fact, even back in 1992, could be accused of a kind of willful ignorance, right? the science on climate change had been widely disseminated in 1990 with the first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report, which showed that the world's climate scientists had reached a practical consensus on the link between human activities and climate change. Anybody still after 1990 or 1992 saying that they weren't aware of the greenhouse effect or the link between human activities and climate change might have been accurate about what they in fact knew, but there wouldn't be any kind of reasonable grounds for accepting that as an excuse. And so the question about culpability does, I think, turn to some degree on what we could know, but can't just be a matter of what we in fact know. If I somehow isolate myself from knowledge and information about my effects on the world, but I go on harming the world ignorantly, that's not really an excuse. If, in some cases, I'm going out of my way to prevent access to information about the effects that my actions are having, that doesn't seem to me like a way to deflect culpability. Up to some point, it seems to me quite reasonable to say that the world's nations were releasing fossil fuel, or were combusting fossil fuels and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a way that really is genuinely ignorant and shouldn't be seen now as being culpable. So the question about culpability that I was trying to talk about in that passage that you read was really getting at the question, at what point should we say that from now on further contributions to climate change have to be seen as being culpable, and those contributing to climate change, whether nations or perhaps even at the level of individuals, should be regarded as being culpable and so then liable for any kind of damage that they do from that point forward. And of course, in the book, my argument is 1990, that first IPCC assessment report should be that year. But I am reasonably persuaded by the case for not taking into account full historical emissions and going back to early industrialization for countries like the United States or the UK or other parts of industrial Europe in deciding on current mitigation or adaptation burdens.
Yeah.
So it's a fairly important question. In some ways it gets fairly technical, but it's also one that I think has a lot of intuitive appeal. It's not that we're blaming, but we are holding liable countries and perhaps even persons for their role in contributing to climate change. And if we're talking about liability and we want to attach liability to faults or some kind of judgment about what we should have done, then these questions about what we could have known or should have known about our impact on the environment become relevant.
Well, we've learned so much in the last 20 years.
Indeed.
What had perhaps some genuine validity, after a while it becomes disingenuous, and
right.
And beyond that, shortly beyond that, it becomes fairly preposterous.
Right. There's all kinds of interesting science left to do.
Yeah.
But it's not calling into question the fundamental connection between human activities and climate change. We wonder what the pace of glacial retreat might be and what effect this will have on biodiversity. We wonder what kind of effect on plankton changes in tropical hurricanes might have. I mean, these are important scientific questions that are related to climate change. But yeah, it's been years, decades, since there was any kind of genuine scientific uncertainty about the connection between human activities, and we know which activities and why, and climate change.
Yeah. You talk about commensurability.
Mm-hmm.
If I can read a couple of sentences here. Okay. You say, total annual adaptation costs cannot be known until after the fact, and so cannot be assigned over future decades, as mitigation targets can. Allowing states to treat mitigation and adaptation imperatives as commensurable and to shift resources between the two at will imposes externality costs when adaptation efforts displace required mitigation actions. For this reason, such cost shifting should be prohibited and mitigation and adaptation burdens separately assigned.
Yes, and for the non-philosophers and non-political theorists, that's bound to come off as fairly dry. But let me try and offer a somewhat livelier version of the same thing. So suppose we ask the question, as many have, including many political theorists and political philosophers, how much should each country do, or how much should each country pay to avoid the problems associated with climate change? So that would include trying to reduce climate change itself, mitigation, but also to try and prevent it from harming people and other things once it's occurred, so adaptation. How much should each country pay for mitigation plus adaptation? So I wonder if we come up with some sort of a number for the United States or for Japan or for Brazil or China, whether it should just be up to the country in question to decide whether to spend that on mitigation activities, reducing its contribution to ongoing climate change, or whether it might instead decide that it wants to spend that money on adaptation activities. Should it just be up to them? Should these be seen as being commensurable responsibilities? And my argument is not, and this goes against the grain of a lot of what others in my fields have been writing, where they want to treat all costs as being in a single category. And the reasons for this are twofold. One, I think, comes out in the passage that you just read. It's just much more difficult to come up with a 10-year or 20-year estimate of what adaptation costs might be, and so it's impossible to plan for how much we might spend on adaptation in the future. But more basically, the reason why I don't see these as being commensurable and why I don't think we should leave it up to, say, the United States, for example, to decide that it would prefer to spend all of its target or quota on adaptation activities is that there's something fundamentally different about adaptation than mitigation. Suppose we said, for example, that we're just not going to try to reduce our emissions anymore, but where climate change occurs, we'll spend money on those problems as they come up. And maybe we'll even prefer to spend them on adaptation activities within our own borders. What we're deciding to do then is to continue to cause harm, acknowledging that our refusal to mitigate our contributions to climate change cause harm. We're willingly deciding to refuse to engage in harm reduction, and we're just addressing climate once climate changes and it threatens human populations. We're treating something that seems like a kind of secondary imperative as a primary imperative. And let me try and unpack that just a little bit further. I'm harming you. I can either stop harming you, or I can give you some kind of pain medicine that makes the harm seem less bad. You don't experience it quite as much. Now, you could say that these are equally good. Reductions in harm should be seen as equivalent to not feeling them quite as intensely. But on a practical and intuitive level, most people would disagree. If we're causing harm, the first thing that we should do, the primary thing that we should do, and this is the reason why the Framework Convention back in 92 emphasized this as the main thing that the world's nations had to do to address climate change. The first thing that we need to do is stop the harm. And if we could do that entirely, if we could completely stop harming, then that would be best. If we can just not disturb the climate system so that the different kinds of predicted impacts come to pass, then we wouldn't have any need to talk about adaptation. But failing that, we do something which is clearly less good. We allow the climate system to change because we just can't prevent it from changing at this point. And we address the harm when it comes up. And we know that the way that we address it is going to be only partial. We can shield some human populations from having a coastline flooded by building a seawall, but it's an imperfect response. We're still raising sea levels. This will have an effect on marine life and all kinds of other things that get left out of the picture when we're talking about adaptation. And I guess the short of it in that passage that you read is that I really want to weigh against seeing adaptation as being a way that we can do our part, shifting the resources that we commit from mitigation, which the United States has reluctantly acknowledged as being perhaps some kind of an imperative, but has committed very little toward, into adaptation, which there's some thinking that if we had to commit some amount of money to mitigation or adaptation, we'd spend more on adaptation. So this is just a way to try and appeal to some fairly complicated philosophical reasons, but also I think some intuitive priorities against that recipe for dealing with climate change.
Well, a man in your position, you have to speak about things, in a certain way, at a certain level.
And, ideally, these problems really are problems that can be usefully addressed with some legal concepts and with some philosophical and political theoretical concepts. They're fairly abstract, but the reason they exist, the reason people have thought about them in the past and have worked out theories, is because they apply in some way, and there is hopefully a practical upshot for applying them in this case.
I think there's also, we don't want to completely eliminate all emotional values or from our considerations, and I think it's fair enough to say that if this was really described to the general public more comprehensively or more directly, more just common sense pitched to the common man and woman, I think we would understand very clearly that mitigation is our moral duty and obligation as a human family, and that adaptation is a very kind of disturbing word that covers most likely the ruination of enormous amounts of people around the world.
I'm glad you said that, because adaptation is used as a kind of dry word that refers to a category of things that's usually regarded as being fairly neutral. It is a very important set of activities once climate change starts occurring. It's a way to try and avoid some bad effects of climate change. But of course, it can't avoid those altogether, and it doesn't even try and avoid effects on anything other than humans, and then certain kinds of effects on humans, and the different kinds of things that go as adaptation. So it's certainly imperfect, nonetheless something that we have to see ourselves as doing. And your other point about trying to appeal on a kind of emotional level or a visceral level, I think is just right as well. I've tried to write about culpability and moral responsibility for just this reason. I think people do have a pretty well-developed, most people anyway, sense of what they're responsible for and what it means to acknowledge responsibility for certain kinds of harm, and that the kind of responses that get connected with acknowledging responsibility in a causal sense and in a moral sense for causing harm are reasonably well developed for most of us, and that we would, if once we acknowledge our role in causing climate change, we as individuals, we as a country, as a people, it's not hard to make the case for what we ought to do.
That's right.
Which is why I think most of the public debate has been around the science issues, because that's a way of avoiding the acknowledgement of responsibility, even of causing. And I think the reason why strategically opponents of carbon regulation have focused on the science is because it would be entirely unpersuasive to acknowledge what we've done and to still say that we shouldn't do anything in response. I think most people realize that's just not a tenable position. Well, and if you can dispute it at the level of causes, we're not causing this problem in the first place, or at least we don't have reliable science confirming that, then you can avoid that ethical debate. And I give people credit for having that reasonably well-regarded, even if not perhaps philosophical sense of the appropriate responses to acknowledging moral responsibility.
Well, I'm sure tens of millions of dollars are spent on perception management and
Indeed.
public relations. And as one of our guests said last week, once you know, you can't not know. And once we know, who are we fooling? There are policies that might make good business sense, but are actually very genuinely, really murderous to a lot of people. Right. And obfuscation, it can be very effective, and that's why it's always our responsibility to see through. See through to our moral obligations as humans, because that's where our happiness is going to be found.
Right, I think that's right. And there is a real responsibility to know here that I think is probably best seen as being a collective responsibility. Mm-hmm. We can say that everybody has a responsibility to inform themselves about their effects on the world, but really we need to inform each other. People working in educational fields have a special responsibility based on their role to try and convey that kind of information. There are others who are in a position to convince those who might be dubious about anthropogenic climate change of what's behind their doubt and what the evidence really does indeed show. Yeah. And that in itself, just the responsibility to notice what we do, what we have done, how other people experience that is an onerous one in itself. This takes a lot of work, and that's without connecting it to what we might do in response. But one that we have to take on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where we're headed. That's where we're headed all over the world, toward a world of responsibility and mutual care, because we are in this together.
Right.
No question about it anymore. I was very delighted to read about the insurance industry and what an asset, what an ally they are to our understanding. These people are not fools, and they're very sober-minded cost analysis of this, that, and the other thing really points us toward toward a great clarity of understanding.
Indeed. Sometimes the climate debates or the climate conflicts get lumped together with other kinds of environmental battles, where on one side is the sort of environmentalist or the public, and on the other side is business, somehow lumped together as though they're all the same and have the same kind of interest in preventing sensible environmental regulations. But it's plainly not the case in the climate debate. There are a few industry actors, certainly, or industry sectors that have been especially vociferous against any kind of climate regulation. But even within those sectors, you have some variation in responsiveness to action on climate change. But the insurance industry presents a great example of a major economic sector that for a long time has, I'd say rather quietly, acknowledged the reality of climate change. And of course they have to. They're the ones that pay out claims from or decide whether or not to insure those living in vulnerable coastal areas.
Right.
And so they can't get on some kind of ideological bandwagon and just say that these effects aren't happening and stick with that story. They have to know whether it's a good economic decision to offer insurance and how much should be required to insure a property in a coastal area that stands to be more vulnerable as a result of climate change. And sure, they haven't pushed the public debate along much, but actuarial tables don't lie, and they've told a much different story than a lot of industry has admitted the last couple of decades.
Yeah. Well, I think this is all very valuable to aid our understanding so that we can be that much more clear about, what's true and not, and, where we need to go. So I'm very grateful that you came on to talk to us. Any last words?
Oh, last words.
For now.
Yeah. When we follow this conference in Durban, we shouldn't fall victim to the low expectations that you observed are surrounding the meeting. We should pay attention to what happens, and we should pay attention especially to things that come out of it as successes. We're not going to have a Kyoto successor come out of this. We're probably not going to have a repeat of what we saw 2 years ago, where President Obama flew in at the last minute and negotiated a controversial so-called Copenhagen Accord as a way to try and save face and make it look like we're making progress toward a Kyoto successor. But we might find some areas of genuine progress. And even though I think media coverage is likely to describe what happens as being a failure, because it'll be seen as a failure if we don't get a Kyoto successor, if we can reach even agreement on some smaller parts of a bigger package, we can take some optimistic assessment from that. These days, any kind of progress is good news. So don't be overwhelmed by the bad news that comes out of this. I think there's a genuine chance for some agreement that could then set the stage for more substantive and more comprehensive agreement in the future.
Well, thanks for your great work, and thanks for talking to us.
All right. Well, thank you, Ken.
Take good care.
All right. Bye-bye.
This is Professor Stephen Vanderheiden, University of Colorado at Boulder, I believe, right now. The book is called Atmospheric Justice, and he's on it. And there's material on the websites, on Google, just to get more of a grip to things are never quite as black and white as we tend to paint them. And there's a lot of bad news, there's a lot of good news, and we're struggling to understand better and better every day, because that's the great excitement of being alive these days.